This is session 5 of Go Luck Yourself. 5 out of 6, so it's our penultimate one. And we're cryptically calling this one Stircus Accidit, which allegedly is Latin. I'm not convinced it's genuine Latin, but it's a term that's often used. And there's the clue down there. It's often used this idea that shit happens. So hopefully it's not a word that offends you. I'll try not to say the word happens again too much in this session. But trying to encapsulate this idea that the stuff that happens in our life which we would perhaps rather not happen, so we might describe it as bad luck, and looking today at the ways in which we might use some of the ideas in psychology, some of which you've already encountered, at least one could be a kind of a new addition to that, in dealing with those experiences you might describe as bad luck. So that's the plan for today. So just to check on where you are in terms of, have you been embracing luck? This is going back to the very first session. Do you now notice that the events in your life which you realise to some extent are down to things over which you have little or no control, and embracing those things, recognising that's an important part of life? Still any thoughts about embracing, a good luck mindset? We talked about that in session 2. Particularly this idea of gratitude and optimism. Again, some of those ideas we'll return to today in the context of bad luck experiences. Noticing opportunities. Is there something happening now where you feel as though there are opportunities that you hadn't perhaps noticed before, or you might not have noticed before, and to what extent you might also even be creating those opportunities? And in session 4, we talked about this idea of going with the flow, recognising the things that we can control, what we can't control, and allowing ourselves to try to kind of go along with events and seeing how that impacts upon our luck experiences. So that's kind of, we're building upon all those ideas today. The constant and gentle reminder about the luck journal, whether it's the hard copy if you have it, or posting it on Blackboard, any way of recording information. I recognise that as time continues, that increasingly becomes a challenge to remember to do that. And don't be too concerned if you feel as though you're just writing very small amounts, or 2 or 3 weeks go past and you think, oh, I could jot that down in there. Anything is useful for me. So even if after these sessions you go back to it and jot some notes and thoughts down there. That's why the hashtag is there, defilge. So the session today is called Stircus Accidit, and it's all about dealing with bad luck. How can psychology help us deal with bad luck? The things we'll look at, we'll begin with exploring this idea of what psychologists have called explanatory style, how we typically explain the events that happen to us. It's something I touched upon very briefly when talking about optimism in that session, because some of the research by psychologists on optimism have also used that term in the context of how people explain the events that happen to them. So I'm returning to it here, looking at it in a bit more detail, because I think it's very helpful in how we explain the negative events that might happen to us. Also linking this to gratitude, it's come up before, so it's coming up again, because gratitude may again be an important aspect of how we draw the best out of bad situations. That will link to this idea of counterfactual thinking. Back in session 1, when I first started talking about how people sometimes use the term being lucky or unlucky, often it can be in the context of where people compare what has happened with what might have happened. And that's what this term counterfactual thinking is about. So again, we're going to return to that and look at how that may be helpful in dealing with events that we might describe as bad luck. And then the bit which is kind of a new addition to this, I think it draws upon all these ideas, is to what extent we can find positive meaning in events that we might describe as adversity, bad luck, misfortune, whatever term we might like to use there. And what I'm going to leave you with then, I'll talk through all of these things, kind of finish the presentation, then there's going to be a short video of an interview with somebody called Martine Wright. And if you're looking at these materials online, there'll be a link to the clip on Blackboard. And I encourage you, once this presentation's finished, to watch that. I'll allow time today so we can watch the brief interview. Martine Wright is somebody who was a victim of the London bombings in 2005. and she describes how she dealt with that experience, in a very negative, traumatic experience. And I think there are many ideas within that may relate to some of the concepts we'll talk about today. So that's the plan for this session. So to begin with then, in terms of dealing with bad luck, one of the first aspects we can look at is how we go about explaining these kinds of events. So broadly put, looking at the ways in which we might explain negative events. And I could have even put the word negative in inverted commas. It's one of my little tricks where I'm not quite sure about explaining a term. I go, well, if we put it in inverted commas, it allows us to say, well, that's open to interpretation. So by that, we're talking about events that we would rather not happen to us. They're aversive, they're unpleasant, where we describe them as being negative events. But there are different ways in which we can explain them. And in terms of what we're looking at here today, this idea of explanatory style, when we try to explain an event, we can come up with causes in our own minds that vary on the extent to which they are stable or unstable, the extent to which they could be global or specific, and I'll talk more about these in a second, and the extent to which we might perceive them as being internal or external. Again, something we've talked about in previous sessions. So let's think of an example. Maybe, let's say you have an interview and it doesn't go as well as you expect. You might think, oh, well, that didn't go as well as it might have done. So you might describe that as some kind of negative event. You didn't do as well as you would hope to have done. Now, your explanation for that could be a whole range of things, your own personal explanation of why it turned out the way it did. If you said that, well, the reason I didn't do very well at that is that I'm not very good at interviews, then that could be an explanation which is stable in the fact that you see it as something which is going to be the same across interviews. So the next time you do an interview, you will still see yourself as maybe not doing so well because you don't see yourself as being very good at them. So that could be stable to some extent. It may also be something which is global in the fact it applies to all the interviews that you do. So psychologists have suggested that when we come up with these kinds of explanations, they may also vary on the extent to which we see them as being global, applying to most things, or very specific. And similarly, if you thought that the reason you didn't do very well was because you're not very good at interviews, it's something about you, so it could be an internal explanation. So you see that particular explanation of how well you did or how badly you might have felt you did could be stable, global, internal. Somebody else, or on a different occasion, you might think, actually, the reason I didn't do so well on that interview is because the interviewer wasn't a particularly good interviewer, or the interviewer was having a bad day. In which case, you might see that as unstable. In terms of each time you go for an interview, it's not going to be the same interviewer, or that interviewer might have a bad day next time. It's more specific. It's not about all the interviews you do. Again, it's something about that one. And it's something external to you. It's not something over which you could have really had much control, whether or not the person's having a bad day or not. Another example may be, thinking of a luck one, having some kind of accident, or maybe a car accident, even a prang or something. You might think, well, the reason that I had that crash, or I bashed the car, I might describe it as being an event which is negative, perhaps an unlucky event. You could explain it in terms of your own driving. If you say it's because I'm a poor driver, it could be more this side of things. If you felt as though it was the weather was particularly bad that day, it was foggy, it may be unstable, because it's not always going to be bad weather, something particular about that day, and it's external. Is that kind of making sense, that the ways we come up with these kind of explanations can vary on these kinds of dimensions? And in terms of then attributing something to luck, even how we go about doing that could have an impact upon where we're seeing the possible causes of these kinds of events. So if we say something was, well, that was just bad luck, then maybe said in that kind of way, we might say it was unstable, it's specific, something about that particular day, it's somewhat, it's nothing about all those kinds of events, it's just that particular one, and it's typically external, if you put it down to bad luck. But consider this, how about if you said something, again putting it down to luck, but said in a different way, I'm unlucky. So the reason I had that accident is because I'm unlucky, and therefore you might see, well, it's going to happen because there's something about me that makes me unlucky. It's stable. I'm applying it to most events because it's an I'm unlucky type description may well be that no matter what I try and do in these situations, it's going to work out against me, and I'm making an internal attribution. It's something about me. So in some ways, you might think, well, they're saying the same kind of thing. This way of thinking suggests that if you're able to, if it's appropriate, if it's something which really was beyond your control, maybe you should try to think of it as something which was unstable, specific, and external. That may allow you to deal better with that experience of bad luck and not see that something which is going to keep occurring. So whether or not you're the kind of person maybe starting this whole Go Look Yourself program more thinking that to some extent I'm an unlucky person, there's ways in which you can describe those kinds of experiences which may be more helpful, more adaptive. And that's where this type of explanatory style has been explored in the context of psychology. So even just how we think about those events could have important consequences in terms of when we experience similar events in the future. So that's the first step, thinking about how we deal with bad luck, how we explain it. And towards the end, I'll suggest ways in which then you might be able to incorporate this into things in the next few weeks.